January 10, 1475. A frozen valley in eastern Moldavia is covered in bodies. Ottoman bodies. 45,000 of them scattered across blood-soaked snow for miles. The most powerful empire on earth just lost half its invasion force in a single day. Came with 120,000 men. Janissaries, who had conquered Constantinople. Cavalry that had crushed the Balkans. Artillery that had broken fortress walls from Anatolia to the Danube. They outnumbered the Moldavians 3-1. By sunset, they were running for their lives. This is the Battle of Vaslui, one of the most catastrophic military defeats in Ottoman history. And you've probably never heard of it because the man who engineered this victory understood something most commanders don't. You can't beat an empire by being stronger. You beat them by making conquest cost more than they're willing to pay. And Prince Stephen III of Moldavia was willing to burn his own country to the ground to prove it. Before we begin, I need to ask something. If you find value in what we're doing here, history told without the fluff, just the raw human decisions that shaped our world, hit the like button and drop a comment. It genuinely helps this video reach people who care about this stuff as much as you do. That's it. Now, let's go back 22 years to the day the world changed forever. May 29, 1453. The walls of Constantinople. Walls that had stood for over 1,000 years. Walls that had turned back Persians, Arabs, and barbarian hordes came down in less than 2 months. The man who broke them was 21 years old. Sultan Mehmed. Nahand had inherited the Ottoman throne at 19, being dismissed as too young, too ambitious, too reckless. His father's generals doubted him. European kingdoms mocked him. The Byzantine Emperor Constantine the Fane believed God himself would protect the city. They were all wrong. Mehmed brought something no previous procedure had. 70 cannons, including the monster called Basilica. 27 feet long, firing half-ton stone balls that could punch through 12 feet of wall. He brought 80,000 troops, a navy that dragged ships overland to bypass blocked harbors, and a cold, methodical patience that ground down every defense. When the walls finally shattered and Ottoman soldiers poured through, Constantine threw off his imperial regalia and died fighting in the streets like a common soldier. His body was never identified. Mehmed walked into the Hagia Sophia center of Eastern Orthodox Christianity for 900 years and ordered it converted to a mosque. He was standing in the building when he made the decision. No hesitation. The message was clear. This wasn't just conquest. This was erasure. Christian Europe went into shock. Constantinople wasn't just a city. It was the idea that Christendom had a shield in the east. That shield was gone. And the Sultan who shattered it was just getting started. Over the next 20 years, Mehmed's armies moved like a flood. Serbia fell in 6 years. Bosnia in 10. The remnants of Byzantine Greece were absorbed. Wallachia, the land of Vlad the Impaler, was beaten into submission and turned into a vassal state. Its princes paying tribute and kneeling to Ottoman authority. By 1475, the Ottoman Empire controlled the Balkans, Anatolia, and the Black Sea coast. They had the best-trained infantry in the world, cavalry that could fight as both archers and shock troops, and a logistical system that could supply armies hundreds of miles from home. They hadn't lost a major campaign in a generation. And now, there was only one Christian principality left, standing between them and total control of the Black Sea, a small forested land called Moldavia. Moldavia sat wedged between the Carpathian Mountains and the Dniester River. 400,000 people, mostly Orthodox Christian peasants and minor nobility, scattered across forests, river valleys, and hills. It wasn't wealthy. It didn't have grand cities or legendary fortresses. But it had something the Ottomans needed: geography, control, Moldavia. and you control the northern Black Sea trade routes. You cut off Poland from the south. You encircle Hungary. You turn the Black Sea into an Ottoman lake with no Christian power capable of challenging you. It was the last piece of the puzzle. And Mehmed II Nest knew it, but Moldavia had survived. This long for a reason. It wasn't strength, it was position. Surrounded by predators on every side. Ottomans to the south, Crimean Tatars to the east, Poland to the north, Hungary to the west. Each one powerful enough to crush Moldavia alone. So Moldavia played them against each other. Alliance with Poland when the Ottomans pressed. Tribute to the Tatars when Poland turned hostile. A careful, exhausting dance of survival that required perfect timing and no mistakes. One wrong move and Moldavia would disappear like Serbia, like Bosnia, like every other principality that thought it could negotiate with empires. For 18 years, Moldavia had avoided that mistake because the man ruling. It understood something about empires that most princes didn't. They don't respect strength, they respect cost. His name was Stephen III, and in 1474 he decided to make the Ottomans pay. Stephen III took power in 1457, the way most princes did in that corner of the world, through violence. His predecessor, Peter III, was a usurper who murdered his way to the throne. Stephen needed an army to take it back. So he rode to Wallachia and made a deal with the one man in the region nobody wanted to make deals with. Vlad Dracula, son of the dragon, the impaler of Turks. Vlad gave him troops. Stephen marched into Moldavia, defeated Peter's forces, and executed him. He was 24 years old, but where Vlad chose terror as policy. Forests of impaled prisoners, night raids meant to traumatize. Stephen chose something different. He studied every battle the Ottomans won. Stephen dissected Kosovo in 1389, Va in 1444, Constantinople in 1453. He learned how the Janissaries fought, how the Sepahi cavalry maneuvered, how Ottoman artillery functioned, how their supply lines stretched across hundreds of miles. He reorganized Moldavia's army. The Kurtene, professional soldiers loyal to him personally, became the core. He drilled them constantly. Modern tactics, coordinated movements. He built fortresses at strategic points, Suceava, Nims, Hin, not to hide behind, but to anchor defense. While his mobile forces struck, and he formed alliances. Poland when he needed northern security, Hungary when he needed western support, even the Crimean Tatars when necessity demanded it. He married his promises to whoever would believe them, and broke them the moment they became liabilities. This wasn't honor, it was survival. By 1474, Stephen had ruled for 17 years. He'd fought Tatars, Hungarians, rival claimants, and Ottoman raiding parties. He'd won most of those fights, not through superior numbers, but through choosing when and where to fight. And he'd come to one conclusion. You cannot defeat the Ottoman Empire in open battle on ground they choose. They have too many men, too much experience, too much resources, but you can make them bleed enough that they leave you alone. In 1474, Stephen decided to test that theory. He stopped paying tribute to the Sublime Porte. Then he invaded Wallachia, defeated the Ottoman vassal prince, and installed his own man on the throne. It was a calculated insult, a direct challenge to Ottoman authority. Mehmed II received the news in Constantinople. The Sultan who had conquered the unconquerable city, who had never accepted defiance, who viewed resistance as an invitation to annihilation. His response was immediate, total invasion, not a raid, not a punitive expedition. Complete conquest, and the man he sent to do it had been at the walls of Constantinople when they fell. Stephen knew what happened to princes who defied the Ottomans. He'd watched it happen to Vlad. Vlad III of Wallachia, Stephen's former ally, had stopped paying tribute and launched a campaign of extermination against every Ottoman in his territory. not just soldiers, merchants, diplomats, civilians. He burned them, drowned them, boiled them, and the ones he wanted to make examples of, he impaled. Mehmed II responded personally, leading 90,000 men into Waqia to crush the rebellion. Vlad knew he couldn't win a conventional battle. So on the night of June 17th, he tried something desperate: assassination. He led a hand-picked force of cavalry straight into the Ottoman camp at Teravish. Hunting for Mehmed's tent in the darkness, trying to kill the Sultan and end the war. In one stroke, they came within yards of succeeding. The Ottoman camp erupted in chaos, soldiers killing each other in the confusion, Mehmed's guards scrambling to protect him. But Vlad couldn't find the right tent. After hours of butchery, he retreated into the night. The next morning, Mehmed's army advanced toward Tavish. And then they saw it, a forest of stakes stretching for miles. 20,000 impaled Ottoman prisoners from Vlad's earlier raids arranged. Along the road in perfect rows, some had been there for weeks, others were fresh. The smell alone made men vomit. Horses refused to move forward. Mehmed stopped his army and stared at the stakes for hours. Then he ordered the advance to continue. Because terror without strategy is just theater, Vlad had made the Ottomans afraid, but he hadn't made them incapable. His army was too small, his resources too limited, his fortifications too weak. Within months, Mehmed installed Vlad's own brother Radu on the Wakian throne. Vlad fled into exile, hunted, eventually imprisoned by the Hungarians who'd promised to support him. Stephen watched all of this from across the border, and he learned brutality gets attention. But it doesn't win wars. What wins wars is making. The enemy question whether the prize is worth the blood. Now, 12 years later, Stephen was about to apply that lesson because the man Mehmed sent to destroy Moldavia was the same man who'd stood beside him at Constantinople. Hardam Sulman Pasha, governor of Rumelia, veteran of 2 decades of Balkan campaigns, and he was coming with an army larger than anything Stephen had ever faced.
Oh no.
Winter 1474, the Ottoman army gathered in Bulgaria and Waqia. Hardam Sulman Pasha commanded between Nanoia, 100,000 and 120,000 men. For context, that's one of the largest Ottoman forces ever sent into Europe in the 15th century. Larger than the army that took Bosnia, larger than the force that crushed Serbia. This wasn't a punitive raid. This was extermination. The core was the Janissaries, boys taken from Christian families as children, converted to Islam, trained from childhood to be elite infantry. They fought with muskets, crossbows, and blades, moved in disciplined formations, and died before they retreated. They'd been the ones who broke through Constantinople's walls when every other unit had failed. Flanking them were the Sepahis provincial cavalry, skilled horse archers who could fire accurately at full gallop or charge with lances like European knights. They were paid through the Timar system, land grants in exchange for military service. Their loyalty was to the Sultan and the land they'd been given. Then came the vassals. Wakian troops under Bazar Bliata, the man Stephen had tried to depose, Serbian auxiliaries, Bulgarian levies. These men had no love for the Ottomans, but they had families in occupied territories, and disobedience meant death. And finally, the Akona, irregular raiders whose job was simple: ride ahead of the main army, burn everything, spread terror, break the enemy's will before the real battle even started. Sulman Pasha's plan was straightforward. March north through Moldavia in 2 columns, devastate the countryside. Force Stephen into open battle where numbers would decide the outcome, then besiege the fortresses until Moldavia surrendered. But there was one detail that made this invasion different from the usual Ottoman summer campaigns. The timing. Sulman was invading in winter. Deep winter, snow, freezing temperatures, frozen rivers. Traditionally, armies didn't campaign in winter, Too hard to supply, too brutal on the men, too unpredictable. But Solon calculated that winter would catch Stephen unprepared. Poland couldn't send reinforcements through snow-choked mountain passes. Hungary wouldn't risk its army in freezing conditions. Stephen would be isolated, unable to mobilize fully, forced to fight alone. It was brilliant, except for one problem. Stephen wanted to fight alone. Stephen had 40,000 men, less than half of what Solon was bringing. The corps was the courtenay, professional soldiers Stephen maintained, personally, paid, trained, loyal. They were his hammer. Then came the veti, lesser nobles, and their retainers, who owed military service in exchange for land. Competent, but their loyalty was to their estates first, their prince second. The largest group was the Razi free, peasants who owned their land and fought to keep it. No formal training, but they knew the forests, the rivers, the hills. And they understood exactly what Ottoman conquest meant. Slavery, forced conversion, their children taken for the Janissary. Corps that made them the most dangerous men in Stephen's army. Stephen had spent 17 years preparing for this moment. He'd studied every Ottoman victory, every tactical formation, every strategic decision, and he'd reached one conclusion. Never fight them on open ground where their cavalry can maneuver. Never. Let them choose the battlefield. Never give them the chance to use their numbers. So when his commanders gathered in December 1474 and asked how they defend against 120,000 men, Stephen gave an order that made half of them question his sanity. Burn everything, not just military supplies, everything. Villages, crops, livestock, grain stores. Evacuate the population north. Poison the wells. Destroy anything the Ottomans could use for food or shelter. One of his boyars, a nobleman who'd fought beside Stephen for a decade, stood up. "You're asking us to destroy our own country." Stephen didn't blink. "I'm asking you to choose between rebuilding and slavery." Solon is bringing 120,000 mouths to feed and tens of thousands of horses that need forage. They're invading in winter because they think we're not ready. So we make winter our ally. We deny them food, shelter, and an easy target. We make every mile north cost them men, morale, and time. And if it doesn't work, then we were dead anyway. The room went silent, because everyone understood what Stephen wasn't saying. This strategy required Moldavian civilians to suffer. Families would lose everything. Some wouldn't survive the evacuation. Villages that had stood for generations would vanish. But the alternative was watching those same families dragged south, in chains. Stephen issued the orders that night. By the time Solon's army crossed the Danube in late December, Moldavia was already burning and the Ottomans were marching into a frozen graveyard. Late December 1474, the Ottoman army crossed the Danube and pushed north into Moldavian territory. The first day, morale was high. This was supposed to be quick, a repeat of Serbia, of Bosnia, of every other Balkan principality that had crumbled under Ottoman pressure. The soldiers expected resistance, then collapse, plunder, warmth, victory before spring. By the third day, they found the first village empty. Every building stripped. No food, no livestock, no people, just ash where the grain stores had been. The well had something rotting in it. Dead animals thrown in deliberately. The commanders sent scouts ahead. They reported the same thing. Village after village, all abandoned, all burned, no civilians, no supplies, nothing. Solomon Pasha assumed Stephen was retreating in panic, destroying what he couldn't defend. A desperate, futile gesture. The Ottoman supply trains stretched. Back to Wakia, they had brought provisions for the march. This was an inconvenience, not a crisis. Then the temperature dropped. The winter of 147,475 was brutal, even by regional standards. Deep snow, winds that cut through wool and leather, temperatures that turned fingers black with frostbite. And the Ottomans were marching through it with no shelter, no hot food, and no idea where the enemy actually was. The Janissaries held discipline. They always did. But the vassal contingents started grumbling. Wackian troops, already unenthusiastic about invading fellow Orthodox Christians, began to suffer. The Sepahi horses, bred in warmer climates, struggled through snowdrifts. Men started getting sick. Still, Sulan pushed north. They'd come too, far to turn back over discomfort. Then the raid started. Moldavian cavalry, light, fast, dressed for winter, appeared out of the forests without warning. They'd hit Ottoman foragers, kill a dozen men, and vanish before any response could form. Then they'd appear 5 miles away an hour later and do it again. The Ottomans tried to chase them. Useless. The Moldavians knew every deer path, every frozen stream, every place where the forest was too thick for heavy cavalry to follow. By the time Ottoman troops organized a pursuit, the raiders were gone. It wasn't just the casualties, it was the exhaustion. No one could sleep properly. Every shadow might be an ambush. Foraging parties needed armed escorts, which slowed everything. Scouts stopped returning. Sulan's intelligence dried up. He knew Stephen's army was somewhere to the north. But where? How many? Were they preparing to defend a fortress or planning an ambush? He had no answers. By early January 1475, the Ottoman army had marched over 200 meters into Moldavia. They hadn't fought a single major engagement, but they were already bleeding, and they still hadn't seen Stephen's main force. 120,000 men need roughly 200 tons of food every day just to stay functional. The horses, tens of thousands of them, need forage. In winter, in a country with nothing left to take, Sulan's supply lines stretched back over 200 miles to Ottoman territory. Through snow, through hostile terrain, through forests where Moldavian raiders cut down supply wagons and disappeared. The rations got smaller, then smaller again. Soldiers started slaughtering horses for meat. Not the cavalry mounts, those were sacred, but the pack animals. Which meant less capacity to carry supplies, which meant even less food reaching the front. Men began dying not from battle, from cold, from hunger, from dysentery that spread through. Camps where sanitation collapsed because no one had the energy to maintain it. Wackian vassals were the first to break discipline. Some deserted outright, risking execution because freezing to death in Ottoman service seemed worse. Others just stopped following orders with any urgency. Why die for an empire that forced you here? Even the Janissaries, trained from childhood to endure anything, started showing cracks, not in battle readiness, but in their faces. Gaunt, exhausted, silent. And through it all, the Moldavian raids continued. A foraging party ambushed here. A baggage train burned there. Never a major battle, just constant grinding attrition. Sulan knew what was happening. His army was being bled to death without ever seeing the enemy. By the second week of January, he had reached the vast region. Rolling hills, scattered forests, frozen streams cutting through valleys. Defensible terrain, but not impossible. And then his scouts brought him the report he'd been waiting for. Stephen's main army had been spotted, not retreating, not hiding. In a fortress, deployed, ready to fight. Sulan's officers urged caution. The army was weakened, undersupplied, demoralized. Perhaps they should consolidate, wait for spring, or pull back to establish a proper supply base. But Sulan understood his situation better than they did. If he retreated without a victory, Mem too would have his head, literally. The Sultan didn't tolerate failure, especially not from commanders who'd promised easy conquest. If he besieged a fortress like Suceava without supplies, his army would starve before the walls fell. If he kept marching north, more men would die every day from cold and hunger, and eventually the army would simply dissolve. He had one option: force a decisive battle, crush Stephen's army with superior numbers, and end this nightmare before it killed them all. So when Stephen offered him that battle near Vaslui, Sulla took it. He didn't realize Stephen had spent 3 weeks engineering this exact moment. That every burned village, every frozen well, every ambushed foraging party had been designed to bring the Ottoman army to this place at this time in this condition. Exhausted, starving, desperate. January 10th, Fall 75. The Hall. 2 armies faced each other, and Stephen was about to show Sulla what happens when you fight a war on someone else's land. The battlefield Stephen chose was a valley near Vaslui, maybe 2 miles across, forested heights on both flanks. A frozen stream, the Barlid River cutting through the middle at an angle. Rolling hills that looked open enough for cavalry, but weren't. The Moldavans held the high ground on the northern end. Infantry positioned along the treine. Artillery. Only a handful of pieces, but placed where they could fire down slope into the valley. Cavalry hidden in the forests on both flanks, invisible from below. The Ottomans deployed in the lower ground, standard formation. Janissaries in the center, solid block of professional infantry. Sihi cavalry on the wings, ready to sweep around and envelop. Vassal troops in reserve, artillery positioned to support the advance. On paper, it was textbook. The formation that had broken Hungarian armies at Vanna, Serbian forces at Kosovo, Byzantine defenses at Constantinople. But paper doesn't account for exhausted men, half-starved horses, and terrain that only looks favorable. Sulla stood, with his commanders studying the Moldavian positions. His officers saw what they expected: an outnumbered enemy forced to make a stand. The math was simple. 120,000 PS against 40,000, 3-1. Even weakened. Those odds should be decisive. What they didn't see was the ground itself. The valley floor was uneven. Snowdrifts hiding ditches, frozen stream crossings that looked solid but would crack under. Weight scattered brush that would break formation cohesion. The slopes weren't steep, but they were steep enough that cavalry charging uphill would lose momentum. And those forests on the flanks weren't just trees. They were cover for however many Moldavian cavalry Stephen had hidden there. Stephen stood on the high ground watching the Ottoman deployment with his senior commanders. One of them, a boy named Stefan Bokok, looked at the mass of Ottoman troops filling the valley below. "We're outnumbered 3-1. Stephen didn't take his eyes off the Ottomans. They marched 200 meters through winter with no food and no rest. Look at their formations. See how slow they're moving. See the gaps between units. That's not an army. That's a mob holding itself together through discipline alone. And if their discipline holds, then we make them break it." Early morning, the temperature was below freezing, breath visible in the air. Both armies waited. Then Sulla gave the order. The Akenu went first. Irregular cavalry, lightly armored, meant to probe defenses and draw out the enemy. They charged up the slope toward the Moldavian vanguard, screaming, firing arrows. The Moldavian infantry braced, pikemen in front, crossbowmen behind. A handful of arquebusers, early handguns, slow to reload, but devastating up close. The Akanyur hit the Moldavian line and were thrown back immediately. Crossbow bolts tore through light armor. Arubuses fired with thundercrack, reports that spooked. Horses, pikes caught riders who pressed too close. The Akanyur pulled back, reformed, tried again. Same result, they weren't breaking through. Sulla watched from his command position. The probe had failed, but it told him what he needed: The Moldavia vanguard was dug in, but not deep. Maybe 5,000 men holding the forward position. Behind them, the main line. Hit them hard enough and they'd fold. He gave the order for a general. Assault, drums. The Janissaries began their advance. Disciplined, tight formation, moving up slope in coordinated blocks. These were the men who'd stormed Constantinople's walls under cannon fire and Greek fire. A Moldavian defensive line shouldn't even slow them down. The Sepahi cavalry on the wings began their flanking maneuvers, curving around the sides of the valley to encircle the Moldavian position. The Moldavian vanguard commander, one of Stephen's most trusted officers, watched the Janissaries coming, thousands of them, professional, unstoppable. His orders were clear. Hold as long as possible, then retreat. Make them think they're winning. The Janissaries closed to 100 yards. 50 Moldavian crossbows and arquebuses opened fire. Men dropped, but the formation didn't break. They kept coming. Contact, the sound of it, metal on metal, screams. Officers shouting orders in Turkish and Romanian filled the valley. The Moldavian vanguard fought hard. Pikemen held the line. Swordsmen filled gaps. Wounded men kept fighting because retreating too early would ruin everything. For 20 minutes, they held. Then the commander gave the signal. The Moldavian vanguard began a fighting retreat, slowly controlled, pulling back toward the main line, making the Janissaries pay for every yard, but retreating. To the Ottoman commanders, it looked like the breakthrough they'd been waiting for. Suleiman saw it, to wide press them. Don't let them regroup. The Janissaries surged forward, and behind them, smelling victory, other Ottoman units followed. The vassal troops reserve contingents. Discipline began to fray at the edges, not collapsing, but loosening. Men pushed forward faster, eager to be part of the final breakthrough. Exactly what Stephen had planned. Because the Moldavian vanguard wasn't retreating in panic. They were leading the Ottomans into the valley's throat. The Ottoman center pushed into the valley, chasing the retreating Moldavians. Janissaries first, then the supporting units, then against standing orders, portions of the reserve. The momentum felt unstoppable. After 3 weeks of frozen misery, they were finally winning. Then the ground betrayed them. What had looked like flat snow-covered terrain from a distance turned out to be broken and uneven up close. The frozen stream crossings that seemed solid cracked under the weight of armored men. Snowdrifts hid ditches that twisted ankles and broke formation lines. The Janissaries tried to maintain cohesion, but the valley compressed them. Units that had advanced in organized blocks now bunched together, shoulder to shoulder, unable to maneuver. The Moldavian artillery opened fire. Only a handful of guns, but positioned on high ground with clear lines of sight down into the valley. Stone and metal balls tore through the compressed Ottoman formations. One shot could kill 5 men if they were packed tightly enough, and they were. The psychological effect was worse than the casualties. Cannon fire in close quarters. The sound alone made men flinch. Duck, break concentration. Officers shouted to hold formation. You can't hold formation when the man next to you just disappeared in a spray of red. Then the crossbows started. Moldavian archers positioned in the forests on both flanks, concealed until now, began loosing volleys into the Ottoman sides. Not scattered shots, mass volleys. Hundreds of bolts hitting exposed flanks where there was no shield wall, no cover. The Sepahi cavalry on the wings, who were supposed to be executing flanking maneuvers, discovered they couldn't. The terrain that had looked passable from a distance was thick with trees, undergrowths, snowdrifts. Horses couldn't charge through it, and the moment they slowed, Moldavian archers cut them down. Sullen, watching from his command position, realized what was happening. This wasn't a battle, it was an ambush. He shouted orders to halt the advance, consolidate, pull back to defensible positions. His officers relayed the commands. Some units heard and tried to comply. Others, already committed and under fire, couldn't disengage. The Ottoman army, 120,000 and strong on paper, was fragmenting in real time. And Stephen, watching from the high ground, saw the exact moment he'd been waiting for. The Ottoman center was disordered. The flanks were pinned. Morale was cracking. He turned to his cavalry commanders. Now the Moldavia heavy cavalry burst from the flanking forests on both sides simultaneously. Boyar lancers, armored, mounted on war horses bred for shock impact, hit the exposed Ottoman flanks like a collapsing wall. These weren't wild charges into prepared infantry. Stephen had timed it precisely. Strike units already disrupted, already under fire, already struggling to maintain cohesion. The impact was catastrophic. Ottoman soldiers compressed in the valley and unable to form defensive squares were ridden down before they could react. Lances punched through armor. Horses trampled. Men who tried to stand. The Moldavian cavalry wasn't trying to break through. They were trying to shatter, and it worked. The Ottoman left flank folded first. And vassal troops, already demoralized and fighting people they had no desire to kill, broke ranks and ran. No dramatic speeches, no final stands. They just ran. That opened a gap in the Ottoman line. Moldavian infantry poured through, hitting the exposed rear of the Janissary formations that were still trying to advance up the center. Now the Janissaries were being attacked from the front and the rear simultaneously. They tried to pivot, form defensive positions, hold ground, and to their credit, they fought. The Janissaries were professionals. They didn't panic easily. But professionalism doesn't stop arrows, doesn't stop cavalry charges from multiple directions, doesn't stop exhaustion and hunger from catching up when you're fighting for your life. One by one, Janissary units were isolated, surrounded, overwhelmed. The Sepahi cavalry on the right flank, seeing the collapse on the left, tried to break off their stalled flanking maneuver and return to support the center. But disengaging from combat is harder than starting it. Moldavian light cavalry harassed them the entire way. By the time they reached the center, the battle had already turned. Sulman Pasha from his command position watched his army disintegrate. Officers were shouting contradictory orders. Units were retreating without permission. The center was collapsing. The flanks were gone. And the Moldavians weren't stopping. They were pressing relentlessly, giving no time to regroup. He made the decision every commander dreads. Save what you can. He ordered a full retreat. But retreat requires coordination. It requires discipline. It requires soldiers who still believe their officers can get them out alive. The Ottoman army had none of those things left. The retreat became a rout. When an army breaks, it doesn't happen all at once. It starts with individuals. A man throws down his weapon and runs. Then a dozen, then 100, then entire units. The Ottoman soldiers ran south back the way they'd come into the frozen wilderness. They had barely survived marching through. No formation, no officers, just survival instinct. Stephen's order was clear. Pursue until they stopped running. Moldavian cavalry hunted them through the forests and snow. Not for glory, not for honor, for necessity. Because Stephen understood what most princes didn't. Mercy today is another invasion tomorrow. Every Ottoman soldier who made it home was a soldier who'd return with reinforcements. Every officer who survived would learn from this and fight smarter. Next time, so there was no mercy. Moldavian horsemen ran down, fleeing Ottomans for miles. Some Ottoman soldiers tried to surrender, shouting in Turkish, dropping to their knees. A few were taken prisoner. High-ranking officers worth ransoming. The rest were cut down. Some Ottomans tried to fight back, forming small defensive groups in the forests. They were surrounded and killed. Others tried to hide, burrowing into Snowdrifts or climbing trees. Moldavia infantry found them. The pursuit continued into the night. Torches in the darkness, screams in multiple languages, the sound of horses and steel, and men begging in words no one bothered to translate. By dawn on January 11th, the valley near Vaslui was a graveyard. Bodies everywhere. Ottoman mostly, but Moldavian too. This hadn't been a clean victory. Blood had turned the snow into red slush that refroed men who couldn't move froze to death where they lay. Scavengers, human and animal, were already picking through the dead. The count, as best as anyone could manage, was staggering. Between 40,000 and 45,000 Ottoman dead, maybe more. Some bodies were never found, lost in forests or buried under snow. For context, that's roughly 40% of the entire invasion force gone in one day. Moldavian casualties were between 5,000 and 10,000. Significant, painful, but survivable. The Janissary Corps, the elite core of Ottoman military power, had been gutted. The vassal contingents were shattered. The Sipahi cavalry had lost thousands. Ottoman artillery, baggage, trains, supplies, all captured. Hardam Sultan Pasha survived. He managed to rally a few thousand men and began the long, nightmarish retreat back to Ottoman territory. Moldavian and Tatar forces harassed them the entire way. Starvation, cold, and ambushes killed hundreds more. By the time Sultan crossed back into Ottoman-controlled Wallachia, he had less than half the army he'd started with. He'd been sent to conquer Moldavia in a single campaign. He returned with the worst Ottoman defeat in a generation. And Stephen III of Moldavia, outnumbered 3-1, had just done what everyone said was impossible. He'd beaten the empire that couldn't be beaten. Stop for a second. Imagine you're one of Stephen's advisors in December 1474. The Ottomans are coming with 3 times your numbers. The empire that took Constantinople, that crushed Serbia, Bosnia, Wallachia. Your prince tells you the plan. Burn your own villages. Poison your own wells. Make your people refugees in the middle of winter. Then lure the enemy into a valley. And hope. Hope that hunger and cold have weakened them enough that 40,000 men can beat 120,000 if it works. You're a genius. If it fails, your country disappears and everyone you know ends up in chains. Would you have made that call? Could you have ordered your own people to suffer on the chance it might save them later? Drop your answer in the comments. I'm genuinely curious what you'd do. And if you're still here, if this story is hitting different than the usual history content, subscribe, hit the bell, because we're not done yet. Stephen just won the battle, but the war, that's about to get worse. News of Vaslui spread through Christian Europe like a shockwave. Messengers rode west to Hungary, Poland, the Italian states. Within weeks, the story reached Rome, Venice, Vienna. A small principality, barely a footnote in European politics, had just destroyed an Ottoman army 3 times its size. Not defeated, destroyed. Pope Sixtus IV received the report in February. He read it twice, certain there had been a mistake. In translation, when his advisors confirmed the details, he declared Stephen III Athleta Christi, champion of Christ, and called for prayers of thanksgiving across Catholic Europe. This wasn't just propaganda. It was desperation, finding hope. Constantinople had fallen 22 years earlier. That wound was still fresh. The Ottoman advance had seemed inevitable, methodical, professional, unstoppable. Every Christian kingdom that stood against them had been crushed or vassalized. The psychological weight of that was breaking European morale. Vaslui changed the equation. If Moldavia could beat them, maybe they weren't invincible. Maybe the tide could be turned. Letters poured into Stephen's court from across the continent. Venice offered trade deals. Hungary proposed an alliance. Poland already technically allied, suddenly became far more interested in honoring that alliance. Even the Papal States sent money and encouragement. Stephen went from border warlord to continental hero overnight. Chronicles written in Latin. Italian and German praised him as the defender of Christendom. Artists depicted him as a warrior saint. Poets compared him to Alexander, to Caesar, to Charlemagne. He was 42 years old, and he just achieved what every Christian prince had been trying to do for decades: prove the Ottomans could bleed. But while Europe celebrated, Stephen stood in the ruins of his own country and did the math. Vaslui had cost him 7,000 men. The Scorched Earth campaign had destroyed a third of Moldavia's villages. Thousands of civilians had died during the evacuation: cold, starvation, disease. The ones who survived had nothing to return to. And Mehmed too, the Sultan who'd conquered Constantinople, who'd never tolerated defiance, who viewed defeat as a personal insult, was still alive. Stephen knew exactly what was coming. Not a punitive raid, not another 120,000-man expedition. Total annihilation. Summer 1476. 15 months after Vaslui Mehmed assembled an army in Thrace. Not through subordinates this time. He would lead it personally. The humiliation of Vaslui wasn't just a military setback. It was an existential threat to Ottoman prestige. Mehmed had built his reputation on conquest. He'd taken Constantinople. At 21, he had crushed every rebellion, defeated every rival, expanded the empire further than any sultan before him. And now, a prince from a backwards principality had just killed 45,000 of his soldiers and made him look weak. Every vassal state was watching. Every rival in the empire was whispering,